Hello, Brobs. We're back with Triad, a novel of the supernatural by Mary Leader. Unfortunately, my work schedule has changed, so the amount of time I have is what determines what I read, and this is the shortest of the options. Chapter 5. Never before in my life had I felt as lonely and helpless as I did standing there on the path between the paper box and the house. How could I go back inside where something waited and watched? I longed to take flight, to leave everything behind and walk until I came to the other side of the darkness surrounding the house. Surely there would be light and comfort and friendly people to drive away the shadows. I advanced a few uncertain steps up the walk, jumping back when something brushed my cheek. It was only a wisp of willow overhanging the walk, and I laughed shakily. To the east, the moon was rising out of the lake, trailing a bridge of light to the shore. If only I could follow that bridge across the waters and out of reach of memory and guilt and fear. It would be so simple. No launch, no orbiting, just a simple stroll across the luminous span. But then the black silhouette of a sailboat knifed through my bridge and severed my escape route. A brisk wind had risen, and cold, not courage, drove me back into the house. After setting some dinner down for Lance, I picked up the kitchen phone and put my finger in the dial. I wanted to hear a human voice. Maybe my friend Sue wouldn't be busy and I could drop over for a chat. Then I remembered this was PTA night and she was president. If Timmy had lived, I'd be there too. Well, what about Ellie? No, this was her bowling night. And Barbara would be at choir practice. I reshuffled my list of prospects. I could call up Millie next door. Maybe she'd invite me over. Hardly likely. Even our egg and sugar borrowing relations had been suspended after Lance had disgraced her lawn one day. Although I apologized and picked it up with a shovel, Millie hated dogs and was a fuss budget anyways. Besides, what good would it do? I'd have to come home sooner or later. I could hardly spend the night. Till tomorrow, then. How to get to tomorrow when Alan would be home. How to get through those crawling hours. Why did he have to be in a profession that took him away so much? I'd spent so much of my life alone. Everyone, they say, is lonely, but an only child is more aware of it, I think, having more time to ponder the oddities of nature and life. I remember how astounded I was when Mother taught me that we see only indirectly through two minuscule lenses, our pupils. She told me this to warn me to be careful of my eyes, but I thought about it for hours. If this was so, then everything I saw was sort of a moving picture of reality, not reality itself. Then what was real? With childish egoism, I could think of only one answer: myself. An answer I didn't like, so I rejected it, as I had no desire to be singular in the universe. Nothing could be more lonely than that. My aunt and uncle died while I was in high school, my father during my junior year in college, and my mother, who developed breast cancer like Aunt Megan had earlier, barely lived to see me get my degree. Cast adrift from my world, I entered that of others. I became a cub reporter, dated and had friends, but the sense of belonging eluded me until Alan came into my life and then the baby. They weren't celluloid characters in a film being run off for my benefit. They were real, and I belonged again. Only now Timmy was gone, and so was Alan in a different way. But he'd be back if I could just get through those hours. A high pitched squeal interrupted my thoughts. The phone was giving its off the cook. I dropped it back in place and glanced around the kitchen, which was a small safety island in the labyrinth of shadow. At first, I was tempted to spend the night within the perimeter of this oasis, but that would be giving into my fears. And once I did that, I was lost, because every night that Alan was away would be the same. Besides, the gloom lurking beyond the door was beginning to draw a straitjacket of claustrophobia about me. If light brought safety, then I would flood the house with it, driving away the specters in an electrical exorcism. First, I flipped on the basement light at the head of the stairs. If I had to go down the steps to do so, I don't think I would have had the nerve. Then I marched through the rooms. switching on lights as I went. I didn't intend to go any farther than the second floor, but once the bedrooms were illumined, even the closets, I found myself inexorably drawn to the old ballroom overhead. The wind had gone wild and was keening around the corners and sighing into the speaking tubes. A branch tapped at a window. Lance, padding along by my side, was my courage. If there was danger, he would sense it. I climbed to the third floor, noticing how deep the stairwell was and how the balusters cast a pattern of elongated stripes on the opposite wall. Suddenly, I knew why Miss Lucinda had given all those phantom parties and kept the house lighted up. Poor, frightened, lonely old soul. And I had laughed at her. I compelled myself to open the door to the black void of the ballroom. I hadn't been up there since my encounter with, well, whatever it was, and groped along the edge of the wall for the switch. The light from the single low-watt bulb in the room made the peeling paint look more scabrous than ever, and the network of cracks covered the walls like an enormous spider web. Blackened bulbs in the other sockets told what a battery of exorcism Miss Lucinda had once used against the shadows. But one by one they had failed her, until only this one was left, and we had never bothered to replace the others. I turned back toward the door, only to wheel around again as the sensation of something breathing down my neck overwhelmed me. Lance snorted and gave a low growl, the hair on his back standing on end, a force stronger than I was trying to assert itself. The wind in the speaking tube seemed to be forming syllables. Triad. The force grew in potency, and no matter which way I turned, it seemed to be behind me. I had a fleeting glance of my terrified face in the mirror and the impression of a dark aura surrounding me. The next thing I knew, I was standing back down in the hall on the first floor without any memory of having descended the stairs. Lance was crouched at the end of the hall, his long nose strangely averted. I called to him to come to me, but he didn't move. Then I saw blood dripping from his lip. But when I tried to examine him, he shrank from my touch, looking up at me with hurt in those great brown eyes of his. Steady there, fellow, I tried to soothe him. Let me see your lip. Why? How did you get that cut? My engagement ring, sparkling in the hall light as I stroked his head, drew my glance to my left hand. A smear of blood trailed across the back of my hand and onto the cuff of my jersey. At first I thought I must have scratched myself, but when I wiped it off, there was no wound underneath. This had to be Lance's blood. What had I done while I was momentarily out? I inspected his mouth again. The cut on his lip might well have come from the rip of a sharp diamond. Oh, Lance, Lance! I wrapped my arms around him and rocked and fondled him like a baby. He whined softly, and his great feather duster of a tail signaled his forgiveness. After I had stanched the blood with Alan's styptic pencil, I went into the living room and tuned the stereo into my favorite classical station, smiling wryly at myself, shades of Miss Lucinda's gramophone. It's strange how even under stress the mind will note and react to the irony, even humor of a situation. Strange, but helpful, a counterbalance to panic, enabling one to go about one's business in a reasonably normal way. Thus I sat down with the novel I was supposed to review, grimly determined to finish it at one sitting. I would read until daylight, and then maybe if I tired myself out, I would fall asleep. I had already turned to chapter 3 when I realized that all I knew of what I was reading was that the action was somehow fitting from stateroom to stateroom aboard a luxury yacht and that somebody was going to be murdered. I laid it aside, deciding to have it out with myself. I might as well ask the question I had been avoiding. Was I losing my mind? Was I schizophrenic? How else could I explain what I had done to Lance? What had possessed me? Possessed. Is that it? Preposterous, I told myself. Such things didn't exist. It was more likely a form of amnesia. Yes, amnesia. That makes sense. Or did it? Was it amnesia that whispered in the speaking tubes? Could amnesia induce me to hurt the dog I loved so much? I looked down at the diamond on my hand that had drawn blood tonight. Not of my will, but wasn't I to blame anyway? What if I were to commit a crime during one of my blank periods? Would I be responsible? No, because it would not have been my intent. Or would that stand up in court? Yet, if I was aware of a problem and kept it a secret, then wouldn't I be responsible? But if I went to a psychiatrist, he might have me. No, I wouldn't go. I would fight it myself. I would will it away, and the thing would be gone. The stereo died at the midnight hour of sign off, and for a moment the pulse of the whole world seemed suspended. Then suddenly the house clamored with the striking of the grandfather clock I bought at an auction. Who had wound it? Its tick was like a noisy heart murmur, and since I bought it more for ornament than use, I had deliberately let it run down after one nerve wracking session of the telltale heart. 9, 10, 11, 12, and old grandfather reverted to his systole. Outside, where the wind had subsided into a low moan, a phantom fingernail lightly raked a window screen. A lilac twig, I reassured myself. The furnace roared on, a faucet dripped somewhere. Time ticked on relentlessly. Then Lance, who had been dozing at my feet, sat up abruptly, his ears quivering, every muscle taut, staring at nothing across the room. And now, on the cusp of a new day, I was at one with him. All the intervening centuries of trained skepticism draining out of me, and somewhere in the dark corners of my mind, a drum was beating. As the wind was silenced and the fingernail ceased, the furnace clicked off. The pendulum fibrillated, then suspended its motions. The faucet held its drip, and everything was deathly still. Then it came, the taunting, almost childlike monotone in the speaking tube, like an acolyte intoning, Branwen, Rhiannon, Branwen, Rhiannon, faster and louder until the two names become one word, Branwen, Rhiannon, still faster until some of the syllables dropped out. Branwen. A humming incantation filled the room, swelling and diminishing with the ebb and flow of the voice. My senses reeled with its momentum. Lance, where was Lance? A little golden kitten lay on the floor in front of me, its pink tongue hanging out of its mouth, its tiny paws outstretched, and my hands were forcing a white porcelain slab down onto it. Only it wasn't a kitten anymore. It was Rhiannon, and her face was blue. Her tongue lolled from the corner of her mouth. Her hands were reaching toward me, the nails broken and bloody, and her eyes frozen in a look of horror and accusation. I shut my eyes and pressed my hands to my ears, but the scene persisted on the interior of my eyelids, and the voice penetrated my hands. Brannanon, or Brahyanan, Rihanna, then broke off into the cruel, mocking laughter I had once known so well. I don't know what I would have done if Lance's joyful barking hadn't shattered the moment. Then a rasp of tires on the gravel driveway, and I was running toward the garage. Alan! What was he doing home so soon? It didn't matter. All that mattered was that he was there. The benison of his arms around me. Branwen, darling, you're shivering, he said as I nestled in his embrace. You shouldn't have run out without a coat. Darling, you're half choking me. You're almost as wild as Lance. Here, let me get my bag out of the car, and then it's inside with you before you catch cold. I clung to his free arm as we walked to the house. Just touching him was my release from the past hours. Before we were halfway, he stopped suddenly, looking up. Hey, what's the idea? He wanted to know. You've got the house lighted up like a Christmas tree. You have stock in the electric company or something? It was such a stale joke, but right now it seemed hilarious. I wanted to celebrate your coming home so early, I laughed, then caught my breath and looked at him apprehensively. How stupid of me. I had no way of knowing he'd be home early. I scratched around in my brain wildly for some plausible answer to the question I was sure would be forthcoming. But he didn't ask it. Instead, he hustled me into the kitchen, where he slung his bag in the corner and sat down at the table, then looked around and sniffed the heavy air. Say, it takes a long time for the smell to go out of that paint, doesn't it? He commented. Yes, it does, I replied, puzzled at his lack of curiosity. Either he was ignoring my slip of the tongue or he just hadn't noticed it. I should have left well enough alone, but my curiosity got the better of me. I'll bet you didn't expect to find me up and waiting for you, I said. Oh, I don't know, he answered. You usually do. In fact, I rather hoped you'd have the coffee pot on. A nice hot cup would be just the thing right now. Of course, dear, I'm sorry, I apologized, plugging in the percolator. Had he written a letter I hadn't gotten, or had I misunderstood which day he'd be back? No, that wasn't possible, because he specifically told me Thursday several times. Did you write me this week? I questioned him, hoping to solve the riddle. No, I didn't. Been too damn busy. Glad I didn't take the time now. I got here before any letter would have. Why? Then how was I supposed to have known? Why was he taking me so for granted? You and I must be communicating by two-way ESP, I finally volunteered. You mean AT&T, don't you? He corrected me, then began to laugh. Oh, now I get it. That was a lousy phone connection we had this afternoon. You didn't sound like yourself at all. Oh my gosh. Oh, no. So spooky. So spooky. So spooky. Goodbye, bruv. Goodbye.